We asked for an interview with a minister about the government's defeat last night, but none was available. No one could get up, obviously, in time. But we are joined by one of the rebels, I'm pleased to say, David Davis. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. Why do you think the government got themselves into this mess?
Well, they were bluntly trying to rig the referendum. I mean, it's been
What evidence did you have for that?
Well, it's been made pretty clear, really from number 10 down, that they wanted to use all the machinery of government they could to get the result of staying in. That's what the sort of government policy line is. And we've seen bits and pieces of evidence along the way. There was the assertion at one point, remember, that ministers would not be able to campaign on the other side, you know, and then they backed off of that when we took them on it. So,
and no decision's been made on that, of course, has it?
No, but they walked away from the assertion that they'd constrained ministers. And this whole component of this bill is a change to a previous Labour bill. There was a Labour bill written 2000, around about 2000, something like that, which was designed to make the referendum on a euro fair. Remember that? And the possible referendum, European referendums there fair. And nobody ever objected to all the Purdah, so-called Purdah, that is, stopping government using...
I mean, they do have to carry on business to some extent, don't they?
Look,
I mean,
in 1997... I was the Europe Minister during the general election. I was completing the last 4 of the last 6 weeks of negotiation on the Amsterdam Treaty. It wasn't just an ordinary part of Europe, it was a major treaty negotiation. I didn't find it necessary to issue a single press release in the course of the 4 weeks of general election. It doesn't stop Europe working if you can't use government machinery to brief on it.
Right. So, I mean, you really didn't feel you could trust the leadership on this. You obviously felt they were, to use your words, they were going to rig this referendum.
There's a fundamental... Vernon Bogdanor, who taught David Cameron his politics at university, made the point very clearly. He said, the point of a referendum is to give authority or to give a decision to something that politicians, the House of Commons itself, can't decide. But it only works if it's seen to be fair. That point, seen to be fair. I actually don't think any attempt to rig these things works.
Right.
But you shouldn't be seen to be anything but fair.
It was very early to inflict such a major defeat, if you like, on your own leadership, on your own government. And it doesn't look good, does it, when backbenchers don't trust their leadership right at the very beginning of the Parliament?
It doesn't look great, I grant you that. But it was their own timetable. And they didn't need to change the original. There were already laws in place to govern referenda, put in place by the Labour Party, which nobody had objected to for 14 years. So why change it now? And I mean, that was their choice, I'm afraid.
I mean, was there any contact? Were there any discussions between you and your colleagues and some of the other senior figures and whips ahead of this?
Vast numbers of discussions. Indeed, the government made a number of concessions, to be fair to them.
And on the key one, really, which is making sure they couldn't call a snap vote. Now,
well, that was important, but it wasn't the key one. It wasn't. No. The key one was the one that basically said Purdah will no longer apply in its normal form. That was the key one, really.
Right, and obviously Labour, no doubt, delighted that they could help inflict that defeat on the government.
Well, I think if this is about getting fair rules, it's the right thing to do. I do think Labour have to be careful not to be opportunistic on these questions. It was very easy in the last Parliament to ally ourselves with David on certain issues. I think Ed Miliband was right to actually take the higher ground and say, no, we're going to oppose a referendum, we're not going to call for a referendum.
Right, so why get involved then in trying to have amendments on a referendum they didn't really want to have?
Because it's important to establish fair rules. I don't disagree with anything that David just said. But I do think this whole spectacle last night is a symptom of David Cameron's weakness on Europe and the weakness of his foreign policy altogether. I mean, you have this titanic European-wide crisis on refugees going on at the moment. And David Cameron is spending his time looking over his shoulder at his backbenchers, looking over his shoulder at UKIP, trailing around his agenda for European reform around the capitals of Europe, not engaging with the European debate properly on migration. I think that's a weak Prime Minister.
And you are helping portray the image that Tom Baldwin does, and you're allying yourselves with the Labour Party that is only...
With the greatest respect, I worry more about the outcome of the referendum than about what the image is for a day or two in a chamber.
Well, is it just a day or two, though? Or is it? I mean, David Cameron's the one who once warned the party stop banging on about Europe.
One area where I disagreed with your commentator earlier is that this is a harbinger of long-term problems on Europe.
You don't think this is a sign of things to come, then?
Not on Europe. No, not on Europe. I mean, I don't think, for example, the Labour Party is going to ally itself with Bill Cash on opposing European measures. Certainly the SNP won't either.
Well, are you sure? Can he be sure about that?
Well, I think Jeremy Corbyn said different things about Europe at different times.
Yeah,
so I very much hope he will not be allying with Bill Cash.
I don't think he will be.
But that is a myth, yes.
And certainly I don't think the SNP will be either. I mean, so I don't think Europe will be the issue. What will be the issue is when a matter comes up that does actually bring a coalescence of Labour plus SNP plus a number of Tories together.
Yes.
I don't know, a civil liberties issue or Snoopers Charter issue or maybe a terrorism and drones issue. You can see that Parliament will actually be flexing its muscles much more.
But
not particularly on Europe, but on more widely controversial issues.
What, though, will be your reaction if David Cameron comes out and says, actually, I'm not going to allow Cabinet Ministers to campaign freely for an out, for example?
Well, I think he'd probably be faced with a bunch of resignations, is what would happen, in truth. What happened when it came up before over a weekend, I mean, I went on the Today programme at 10 to 8, and at 10 past 9, the policy had changed. Now, I think they're sort of finding their way a bit on this. So I don't think it's likely to go the way you describe. I think what will happen is 4 or 5 cabinet ministers and a number of other ministers will say to him, look, if you force us, then we have to go.
But there is a battle. There is a battle, though, isn't it? When I said there's still sign of things to come, that's another battle down the line.
But that's not a parliamentary battle. It's a battle inside the government. I think.
Right, and the party, of course, in terms of how it react to it.
Yeah, to a point. Yeah.
Right. OK. I mean, what about the Conservative backbenchers? Are they emboldened, do you think, people like you, because Labour is in disarray, arguably?
No, I don't think so. I think emboldened is probably the wrong word. There are people who will waste their vote and just vote against this and be problematic for its own sake and so on. There's no doubt that such people exist. But most parliamentarians of all colours want to change things. And actually, with a balance of power in Parliament now, with a majority of 12, with a pretty cohesive SNP all playing together, with Labour sort of changing its mind, we don't know where it's going to end up in a week or two's time, there are areas and issues which we can't even predict, which people say, actually, I don't agree with the government on this, I want to do something else. Your debate before I came on about drones is a good example. If we'd been talking last week, I would never have forecast that being an issue for this week, but it's clearly going to be very controversial in the future, and people on all sides are going to say, I want the government to go in this direction.
Stay with us.
Yeah.
Email, text message, voicemail. There are so many reliable forms of communication in the modern age, so why are ministers reported to be turning to the humble post-it note to tell colleagues what they think? Here's Adam to explain.
It's amazing what you can find lying around here. Look, it's a secret government document with a post-it note on it saying, "What a load of rubbish," signed by a minister. It's reported this is what's happening in Whitehall these days. Ministers write critical comments on post-it notes because they can scrunch them up and throw them away and they won't be subject to the Freedom of Information Act. What's this? Let's hope this never gets out. Oh, it's one of Prince Charles's memos to ministers. They were released because of the Freedom of Information Act. It also indirectly led to the MP's expenses scandal. It's got some notable critics, though, this law. Tony Blair introduced it when he was in government, and he said it was one of his biggest blunders ever. And now ministers are doing a review into whether information has been a little bit too free lately.
Oh, thank you for that, Adam, on a post-it note. And David Davis, who's campaigned on freedom of information, is still with us and obviously enjoyed that. Why are you not happy with this, then?
Well, firstly, it's a breach of all the guidelines. There are various ministerial guidelines for ministers and indeed for civil servants, that they should properly document what they're doing. It should be possible to trace it, not just for FOI reasons. I mean, when I worked in the Foreign Office, if somebody would send up a policy paper, I'd write in the margin, I agree with this, and something ruder than that sometimes, and it would go back down, and everybody would see it. The person who wrote it, his boss, my boss, and it would be a way of communicating. You start sticking post-it notes on things, it starts to undermine all of that.
Right.
But also, of course, it completely wrecks the whole point of FOI. And FOI has been uncomfortable for ministers, but it's been fabulously successful in all sorts of ways.
Well, do you agree with that? Because Tony Blair said it was one of his biggest regrets. I mean, surely there are some documents and some things that shouldn't be seen by the public eye.
Well, I mean, there's certain ministers, I'm sure David would probably name them as well as I could, whose depth and breadth of vision probably wouldn't fit on a post-it note.
So there could be technical problems with the...
But look, the truth is this, that things like freedom of information are generally beloved by oppositions and loathed by government. And I think it's to the eternal credit of the last Labour government that they put in something, a measure which actually helps scrutiny of government. And I know David's campaigned on this. I know many people in the Labour Party have campaigned on this, continue to do so. I think freedom of information is a good thing, and it's a credit to the last Labour government.
Would you still say that if you were a minister?
Yes,
I mean, David Davis, I mean, isn't that the salient point? Yes, of course it's loved by oppositions or people who aren't ministers, but don't civil servants need some space?
A little bit of space, but that's protected already.
Is it? How is that little bit of space protected?
There are policy protections already in place for policy documentation. And certainly, of course, all the secrecy and so on. It's very difficult to get things out. There was a very good example about 2 weeks ago when information came out about what happened to people who'd had their welfare, their benefits withdrawn. Remember the death rates and so on? Now, I support the policy, but, you know, it's got uncomfortable statistical outcomes, and to put it at its mildest, with people dying.
Well, how many? Was it 1,400 were said to have died following their changes to welfare?
Incredibly uncomfortable for the minister, but incredibly important that gets out in the public domain so the debate is properly informed.
I mean, but is it ever justified then, David Davis, in your mind, to avoid public disclosure? You've talked about this. You know, what about intelligence, or what about high-level security issues?
Even intelligence disclosures are sometimes, I can say, the redactions are rather more political than they are security-driven. You know, I mean, I had to clear some redactions on the overrun on the costs of building Vauxhall Cross and MI5. Right, those the two buildings. The redactions were so ridiculous; they were all about, you know, avoiding the blame, and we got rid of most of them, and there was no security failure. So there are lots of areas where they're overused. Classifications overused, redactions overused, but there are a small number of areas which are protected. The current FOI arrangements easily protect that and more.
Right, do you agree? I mean, do you think there should be more protection? I mean, there is a review going on of freedom of information.
But look who the review is.
We'll come back to you on that, but do you think it's the right time to review it?
Always keep the things under review, but I think given the kind of things that have come out, things that we would never have known about, things that the public had a right to know about, it's a good law, and let's not fiddle with something that's working too bad.
I mean, do you actually think people are using these post-it notes on a sort of industrial scale? It's made quite a nice film and a good talking point, but is it actually happening?
In my day, it was a joke. You know, stick a post-it. Nobody ever did it, but people joked about it. Now it appears to be happening here. It appears to be happening in New Zealand and Australia, all over the world where FOI exists. It's now obviously a standard trick. Right,
but I mean, you were head of communications. Sometimes there has to be some space, doesn't there, for the sort of things you need to discuss to get to a reasonable position without worrying that those discussions, some of which perhaps were either silly or maybe verging on the dangerous, you just don't want them out there.
Well, you obviously... No, not as a political party, but when decisions are being taken, when there's information which is pertinent to people's jobs, people's lives, people's communities, I do think it should come out. Now, you know, there's been studies of this, whether there's a chilling effect in terms of debate within ministerial offices, within government. There's no real evidence that it's had that chilling effect.
No. I mean, bear in mind, most of our decisions anyway are made effectively in the public domain. The debate goes in the public domain. The idea that there's some secret other reason for a decision is wrong 19 times out of 20.
Right. There are all kinds of organisations which have their own private narrative about why the public shouldn't be let in, about why people don't need to know, why, you know, it's best that if they're not burdened with this knowledge. 9 times out of 10, they're wrong.
What about the review? You were going to say, look who's on doing the review.
It's chaired by an insider, Burns, the ex-head of the Treasury. You've got Michael Howard, who's got views on this, I think, already. Jack Straw, who said it was a mistake. Carlisle, who was the spooks inspector and always in favour of covering things, or not covering things up.
So you think it's a stitch-up?
I think it's a stitch-up.
All right, well, on that, David Davis, thank you.